Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are digging into a policy that's really shaping China's next chapter. Common prosperity, or Gongtong Fuyu. We've pulled together research looking at, where it came from historically, its economic underpinnings, and how it's actually being put into practice now.
Yeah, it's absolutely central, but it's also, I think, widely misunderstood outside of China. People hear common prosperity and often jump straight to thinking it means pure equality,
Yeah.
or even this idea of robbing the rich to help the poor, jifu jifu.
Right, and that's the first big assumption we need to tackle, isn't it? Because the sources we looked at are quite clear that the policy explicitly tries to avoid that.
Absolutely. The goal here, our mission for this deep dive, is to really understand that CP is about prosperity for everyone, but crucially, while still allowing for reasonable differences. It's framed as a structural fix for a structural problem. So we need to unpack, how it's defined, how the whole ownership system supports it, and what tools like these three distributions are actually being used to, well, move things towards greater fairness.
Okay, so where do we start? History seems key here.
Definitely. To get why this is such a big push now, you have to look back. The sources argue that common prosperity aims to solve a problem that plagued Chinese history for centuries. Even in golden ages, like the Han or Tang dynasties, there were these two persistent issues that ultimately destabilized things.
Which were land concentration and extreme wealth gaps, right?
Exactly. The sources bring up that famous line from the Tang poet Du Fu. The rich have meat and wine that stink, while on the road lie the bones of the frozen dead. It's brutal, but it shows that even with apparent stability, that underlying economic unfairness was, well, catastrophic.
So the argument is just swapping emperors wasn't enough. The actual economic system, the mode of production, had to change fundamentally.
That's the core argument presented, that it was only through the socialist transformation in the 1950s, specifically public ownership of land and socializing industry, that the root causes of these historical cycles could finally be addressed. That established a different foundation.
And that foundation got tested pretty early on during the reform era, didn't it? There's that interesting anecdote in the sources about Deng Xiaoping in 1985.
Ah, yes, the meeting with Robert Mugabe from Zimbabwe. Deng actually acted as the translator.
And Mugabe was worried, basically asking if China's reforms were just, sliding back towards capitalism.
Right. And Deng's answer was really significant. He insisted, no, the four modernizations are socialist modernizations.
And he laid down two core principles then and there. What were those, and why were they so important in that conversation?
The first was keeping public ownership, that's both state ownership and collective ownership, as the main part, the backbone of the economy. Back then, it was over 90%. The second, and this is really crucial for today's topic, was explicitly avoiding Lianji Fenhua extreme polarization, that bipolarization of wealth.
That sounds like the absolute bottom line. He basically warned that if the reforms created that kind of polarization, they'd failed.
He did. That warning, decades ago, is presented as the strategic driver behind the current common prosperity push. It's addressing that long-standing concern.
Okay, so that historical mandate sets the stage. How did the economic structure itself evolve to try and maintain that balance? You mentioned stages of ownership.
Yes, the structure wasn't static. It evolved sort of in three phases, moving from thinking about quantity, how many state firms, to thinking more about quality and control.
Let's take the first stage then, after the 1950s.
That's when the state and collective economies were established.
Mm.
The key point the research highlights is the method. China used a buying out policy for private capital, unlike the Soviet approach of just taking it. By 1978, state-owned enterprises, SOEs, were about 56% of the economy. And importantly, collective enterprises, which later became the township and village enterprises, TVEs, were critical for that first wave of industrialization and spreading wealth beyond just the major cities.
Okay, then stage two, the Deng era up to 97, the private sector starts to grow. How did they balance that with keeping public ownership dominant?
Public ownership definitely stayed dominant, around three-quarters of the economy. Private business was seen more as a necessary supplement, that could bring in competition, efficiency, but the really foundational assets, like land and major resources, stayed firmly in state hands.
Got it. And stage three, post-1997, seems like a big shift in definition, not just counting heads of state enterprises anymore.
Exactly. The 15th Party Congress broadened the idea of public ownership. Now it included mixed ownership, where the state or collective just needed a controlling stake. The emphasis shifted. It became more about the advantage of public assets owning the land, minerals, strategic sectors, and the dominant role the state economy plays in guiding the market overall, rather than just the sheer number or percentage of state companies.
which leads to this two unwavering principle we hear about now: consolidate the public sector and encourage the private one.
That's the framework. And it's positioned as what allows the state to actually fund initiatives related to common prosperity. The sources give good examples. Think about infrastructure, like communications. Private firms in the U.S. might hesitate to build cell towers or high-speed internet in really remote rural areas because the return on investment is slow.
Right, not profitable enough, quickly enough.
But in China, state-owned companies went ahead and did it, built networks everywhere. Same with the high-speed rail, the highway's largest networks in the world, built by the state.
And that huge public investment then creates the platform, the foundation for private businesses everywhere to actually connect and grow. That sounds like part of the common creation ideal.
Precisely. It enables broader participation in wealth creation. But even with that growth strategy being successful, and China did eliminate extreme poverty by 2020, a huge achievement, that other problem Ding worried about emerged: the widening wealth gap.
The inevitable side effect, perhaps, which demanded a new set of tools.
Exactly. And that's where the three distributions come in, as the mechanism discussed in recent government planning.
Okay, let's break these down. The first distribution.
That's the basic market one.
Yeah.
Income from your job, from investments based on efficiency, capital, labor, input. The key guideline here is that the initial gap created by the market needs to be kept within reasonable limits. This means things like enforcing labor laws effectively.
But how do they manage reasonable limits without killing the market incentive? That sounds tricky.
Well, the emphasis seems to be on things like minimum wage enforcement, protecting worker rights, ensuring capital doesn't totally overwhelm labor in negotiations. But the real work of balancing things out falls more to the second distribution.
Which is the government stepping in based on law and fairness.
Yes. This is primarily about taxation and Social Security. The sources mention a shift towards more direct taxes. Think property taxes, maybe capital gains, things that target wealth more directly than consumption taxes. And strengthening the social safety net. The stated aim is creating that olive-shaped society. Smaller numbers at the very top and bottom, big bulge in the middle class.
And you mentioned earlier this is working quite well for regional gaps.
The data on transfer payments is quite striking, actually. In 2020 alone, the sources state over 8 trillion RMB was transferred from the richer coastal regions to the less developed inland and border areas. That's a huge amount, and it's a major reason why the gap between regions is closing faster than the gap between individuals' incomes.
Wow, 8 trillion. That's significant. Okay, what about the third distribution, the one involving morality, charity?
This is positioned as supportive, not primary. It's about encouraging businesses and successful individuals to voluntarily contribute to public welfare, philanthropy, that sort of thing. It adds a cultural or moral dimension.
But development still comes first, right? You can't just redistribute your way to prosperity if the overall pie isn't big enough.
Absolutely critical point. The research stresses this. China's GDP per capita is, what, over $10,000 now? But it's still considered an upper-middle income country, aiming for high income status. Simply dividing the current national income equally wouldn't make everyone prosperous. So high-quality development, growing the economy sustainably, is seen as the only path. No shortcuts.
Okay, so they have this complex strategy. How are they testing it? You mentioned Zhejiang province.
Right. In June 2021, Zhejiang was named the first demonstration zone for common prosperity.
Why is Zhejiang specifically?
Well, it was already doing relatively well on narrowing inequality. Its urban-rural income ratio in 2020 was 1.96, much lower than the national average of 2.56. It had high economic vitality, lots of private enterprise, so it was seen as fertile ground.
And the scope in Zhejiang shows this isn't just about money, is it?
Not at all. The plan there covers everything: ecology, infrastructure, better education, public health access. It really underscores that common prosperity is envisioned as a much broader concept than just income redistribution. And they're aiming high substantial progress by 2025, which is a decade ahead of the national target for 2035.
And part of Zhejiang's success is apparently down to its entrepreneurial spirit.
Right.
Lots of smaller businesses.
Yes, that common creation aspect.
Yeah.
Having a high density of small and medium-sized business owners, lots of people actively involved in generating wealth from the ground up, that seems to naturally help manage the initial or first distribution disparity.
Now, measuring success brings up the Gini coefficient. The sources suggest we should be cautious about relying solely on that number for China. Why?
The main issue is that the Gini typically measures monetized income or consumption gaps. But in a vast country like China, especially in rural areas, a lot of wealth or well-being isn't cash-based. Think about things like owning your own home outright, growing your own food. These aren't always captured well in standard income figures. So a national Gini might look worse than the lived reality in some ways. Regional Gini figures, like for a specific city or province, can sometimes be more telling.
That leads to a really interesting comparison the research made about household wealth,
Yeah.
comparing China and the U.S.
Yeah, this one's quite surprising. If you look at average household net assets, the U.S. is still higher, about 4.8 million RMB, compared to China's 2.89 million RMB.
Okay, that makes sense. But the median,
But the median net assets for urban residents in China have apparently already surpassed the U.S. median.
let's pause on that. The median is the middle point. Half the population has more, half has less. So half of China's urban population is wealthier in terms of net assets than half the U.S. population.
That's what the data suggests. It implies that while the U.S. might have much higher wealth concentrated at the very top, skewing the average upwards, the actual distribution of wealth among the broad middle in China's cities might be becoming, well, more robust or widespread, perhaps partly due to policies around things like housing ownership.
Fascinating. Okay, looking forward, what are the potential pitfalls? The sources mention avoiding certain diseases.
Right, the tightrope walk. The idea is to avoid the Greek disease getting caught in an unsustainable welfare state that dampens work ethic and leads to debt crises, but also simultaneously avoid the American disease perceived as laissez-faire capitalism leading to extreme inequality and social division. China has to chart its own course between those extremes.
And we touched on the third distribution charity. What's the specific warning there?
The sources are pretty cautious about over-relying on it. The historical point is that charity alone has never solved deep-seated inequality. And there's a concern, drawing from examples elsewhere, that large-scale philanthropy can sometimes become, frankly, a tool for tax avoidance rather than genuine wealth redistribution. So it needs to be truly voluntary, a supplement, not a replacement for the second distribution's job, especially taxation.
Which brings us back to that core tension, avoiding robbing the rich, Jipin. How do you encourage contribution without it feeling like coercion, especially for successful entrepreneurs? Doesn't that risk dampening the drive to succeed? The whole do-aloud idea, earn more for working more?
That's the absolute crucial balance they're trying to strike. It's why you see repeated official statements emphasizing Jipin must be avoided. Reasonable differences in income and wealth must be allowed to keep the economy vibrant and motivate people. Protecting property rights, both public and private, is stated as fundamental.
So the framing is more about societal responsibility than force giving.
Exactly. The argument presented is that significant wealth creation didn't happen in a vacuum. It relied heavily on the stability, the infrastructure, the educated workforce that the state, using public resources, helped provide. So fulfilling basic legal duties, like paying taxes properly, is seen as foundational. Beyond that, voluntary contribution is encouraged as part of a broader social expectation.
It's a complex picture. State lays the groundwork, enables growth, then uses distribution mechanisms to ensure the benefits are shared widely, but without aiming for forced equality.
That seems to be the strategic intent outlined.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive really shows common prosperity isn't just a slogan or simple redistribution. It's a very detailed, long-term strategy, deeply tied to China's political and economic structure, trying to balance quality growth with, well, fairness.
And the backstop, the institutional guarantee that the state can intervene to correct course if polarization gets too extreme, is explicitly linked in the sources to strong political leadership and that dominant role of public ownership. It provides a kind of safety net. Think about disaster relief, for instance. After a major earthquake like Wenchuan, the narrative is the state steps in to rebuild, backed by public assets, rather than relying mainly on individual insurance payouts like in some other systems.
That sense of ultimate state responsibility is a key difference. Okay, so we've seen the second distribution, especially those huge regional transfers, has been pretty effective at tackling geographic inequality.
Yes, significantly narrowing the gap between regions.
So here's the final thought for you, our listeners, to ponder. The goal is that olive-shaped society, right? A massive middle class. If transfer payments worked well for regional gaps, what kind of new structural policies, maybe related to the first or second distribution, might be most effective in the next few years to really accelerate the growth of that individual middle-income group? Something to think about based on the principles we've discussed today.
A very relevant question for the future.
Indeed. Food for thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.